That made more impact than my voice too. So anyway, good evening, everybody. For those of you who don't know, my name is Kirk Ressler, and this program is Great Decisions, which is sponsored by the Foreign Policy Association in New York. If those in the back cannot hear, let me know, because we do have microphones that we can do that. But I think that from my prior experiences, the voices carry. It's okay. So this afternoon, we have the honor of having Ambassador Isabel Coleman with us. She has had a varied career, both in the private sector and the public sector. And of most interest to us.
Do you hear anything?
Not yet.
Okay.
No?
All right, so maybe we'll use the microphone just so the folks on Zoom can pick us
Folks on
up.
Zoom can't hear.
Yeah, I think
I
that.
can hear fine.
Oh, you can hear? All right.
All right, well, we'll keep doing it this way unless we get more complaints. So anyway, of most interest to us, she was the ambassador to the UN for management and reform from 2014 to 2017. And then she was the #2, the deputy administrator at USAID for policy and programming from 2021 until earlier this year. So I won't say any more, Isabel. You have many things that you can talk about, and we'll just start.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here and wonderful to see so many people who are interested in foreign assistance, given what a bad name it's had of late. Most people had never heard of USAID before Elon Musk took a great interest in it, and his Doge team effectively shut it down this spring. And Americans were bombarded by really a litany of egregious things that USAID had supposedly done. And I can tell you that people always say to me, why don't you talk about what all the good things USAID has done? And I say, the things that have been reported in the press have been largely debunked by very reputable journalists and newspapers. And, that just doesn't quite break through. But the reality is that pretty much all of the things that you've heard about USAID were either grossly distorted or outright fabrications. The agency has certainly had its wins over the years and its misses, but the types of things that were being reported were really gross distortions. So I thought it would be helpful to just start out explaining what USAID even was and what it did, because most Americans have never heard of it before this spring. It was a 63-year-old agency that had been established by John F. Kennedy as an instrument of American foreign policy and of really an extension of American values and soft power in the world. And over the decades, it worked in over 100 countries and did a whole range of different things. During my time that I was there, the budget was about $30 billion. That sounds like an extraordinary amount of money, which it is, but that accounted for less than half of 1% of the US federal budget. So really, really tiny amount of federal spending. And you can think about it in three main buckets. So the first is humanitarian spending. There really wasn't a crisis that occurred around the world where USAID wasn't present, trying to help those most in need. Most of them were man-made. 80% of the places where USAID worked were conflict-related zones in the world. And it was addressing, famine in a lot of countries that were largely man-made, from famine in Sudan to acute food security in many, many countries, including Gaza and Niger and you name it, Haiti, just many different places around the world. But also natural disasters, earthquake in Haiti or floods in Pakistan. It was USAID on the ground, often working in close partnership with our military to be able to provide US assistance delivered from the American people, branded with big logos from the American people to really reach those most in need. So it was true to say, I think that it saved just tens of millions of lives over the 63 years on the humanitarian front. The second big bucket is global health. And here I think USAID had unequivocally its greatest successes. USAID was responsible for helping to eliminate smallpox in the world, vaccinating millions and millions of children. In fact, in the last 25 years alone, USAID vaccinated nearly 1 billion children, for a whole range of preventable diseases with the vaccines, from polio to measles to treatment for pneumonia, just pneumonia. So many millions of children under the age of 5 die of pneumonia. So global health has been a tremendous win for USAID around the world. 26 million people today are alive because of USAID funding of antiretroviral drugs for those with HIV in the continent of Africa alone. So, I mean, it really is an extraordinary track record there. And then the third bucket is economic development. And that is just a very wide myriad number of things. A lot of it was working with governments where governments were capable and trying to do the right thing for their countries, working with those governments to improve the economic conditions of those countries. So a lot of it was agricultural work, providing improved seeds and farming techniques, fertilizer, because at the end of the day, these countries that are the poorest of the poor, they're largely agricultural based, and USAID was very much part of the Green Revolution that started back in the 1960s and has gone through numerous iterations, but has really allowed countries around the world to better feed themselves today. So some of that type of work, it is also doing work with governments on public financial management, helping governments put in place anti-corruption measures, tax codes that would allow them to collect more resources and revenues from their own people so that they would be able to actually do more for their own economies on their own. This trying to make countries more self-sufficient. So that was another big area. And then, of course, there were countries that USAID worked in where we were at odds with the government, where we nevertheless worked with civil society groups to try to bring transparency and anti-corruption measures to bear, and a lot of civil society organizations that were pushing for better governance and better democratic practices in those countries. So it was really a range of things that USAID was doing. And when you look at the world today, now that USAID has effectively been shut down, people ask me, like, what will be the impact? And I think it's hard to say exactly what the impact will be. Some have estimated that as many as 3 million people will die this year alone from the shutdown of USAID. And there are people who, their lives were never counted to begin with, and their deaths most certainly won't be counted. They're the poorest of the poor, children under 5, elderly, people living, as I said, in conflict zones, in places that you've really never heard of. And I think we won't really know the true impact for many years to come, because it will just be very hard to measure, but it will show up not only in lives lost this year, but over time with fewer children going to school, in particular, fewer girls going to school, higher birth rates. One of the allegations against USAID is that it was funding family planning. Yes, in fact, it did. The US government, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, has been the largest funder of contraception around the world. It's the #1 way to reduce maternal death in the world, is by providing access to contraception for families to make choices about when they have children and how many children they have. So You will see more mothers die in childbirth. You will see more children dying from preventable diseases. You will see less clean water. You will see less lands preserved for healthy ecosystems. There'll be losses that are hard to pinpoint and to measure, but they will accumulate over time. And when people say to me, another question, will other countries step in and make up the gap? And I think that's highly unlikely because, as I said at the outset, the US funding, even though it was just a tiny fraction, 0.25% of our, under 0.5%, anywhere from 0.25% to about 0.4% of the US federal budget. Other countries are spending such a higher percentage of their own economies. 1% of GDP is Norway, but they're such smaller economies than the United States that it just doesn't add up. And there have been new donors coming into the mix. You know, USAID was very active in South Korea, all during the 1960s, and then South Korea graduated from being a USAID recipient to becoming an important donor itself. Mexico, another example, USAID helped set up Mexico's own foreign assistance arm within its government. And it now does its own programming for countries south of its border. But, you know, it would take 20 South Koreas to make up for what we have lost in terms of the USAID budget. So what have we lost? And for me, when I talk about foreign assistance, I think about it as important really for two reasons. One is just self-interest. I think the United States is safer and healthier and better off when countries around the world are themselves safer and healthier and more democratic. I mean, when I think about, for example, when I was at the UN as one of the US ambassadors, one of the crises we were dealing with was the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. People were predicting nearly 1 million people would die from that Ebola outbreak. President Obama sent troops and put troops on the ground in West Africa. Huge, enormous political risk to do that. But it was able to really help contain and isolate that. In the years since, you don't read about Ebola that much anymore. But we have constant Ebola outbreaks. In the years since, USAID has worked in the countries of West Africa and Central Africa to set up early warning systems, to train doctors, to establish labs, so that when an Ebola case appears, it's nipped in the bud very, very quickly. They can deal with it themselves. US troops are not being put on the ground again to try to deal with something like that. So, you know, we are healthier, we are safer, I think, when we are providing foreign assistance overseas. That's the first reason, just self-interest. And I would add to that, it helps countries resist the enormous pressure so many of them are under from China, that they have really struggled to have an alternative to some of the predatory lending and some of the predatory practices of China, and being able to have an alternative from the US government, I think, has been a very important foreign policy and national security tool for the US government. And we won't know the full ramifications of the shutdown of USAID for years to come. The second reason is just one of, and this is my own bias, but of values. We're the richest country in history. And for us to not invest some money in the poorest of the poor, I think is not the right thing to be doing. And I will, you know, quote the words of President Bush when he set up in that farm. He said, "We have the power to save lives and to help people, and that is what we should do." We do. We have the power to do it. We are a wealthy country, and to put some money into foreign assistance, I think, is a very good thing to do. It shouldn't be endless. Our generosity, of course, should have limits because we have huge needs in this country. And I will tell you, having worked in government for the past decade, there is waste and inefficiency in government. And one of the great shames for me is that USAID was shut down at a moment when its programming was undoubtedly more effective than it has ever been, because we were bringing modern, basic scientific methodologies to the work we were doing. Randomized control trials have been used in the scientific sphere for many decades. Does this drug really work? You have a control group to test it. In the development sphere, that type of research has only happened in the past decade. And it has been led by development economists like Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, Michael Kramer. They've won Nobel Prizes for this work. And one of the reasons I went to USAID was to make it more efficient and more effective, knowing that American taxpayers deserve every single one of your dollars to go as far as possible and to do the most good. So cost effectiveness is hugely important. And I ascribe to that, and I brought that mentality to USAID. I hired one of these fantastic economists to come and work at USAID and to bring the whole scientific approach of randomized control trials to the program we were doing. It is not enough to say, hey, we want to reduce malnutrition in this country. How are you going to do that? You can do this set of interventions, which we have hard evidence works, or you can do what you have been doing, which we don't have hard evidence about. So either create the evidence or stop doing that and do this. And that was the shift that we were really driving at USAID in recent years. So do I think that there was lots of room for improvement? Of course, I wouldn't have gone there if it were a perfect organization that didn't need additional leadership and help to make it better. But do I think it should have been shut down? No, I think it's a big loss. And it's a loss, you know, people say, well, can't the State Department just do it? But Kirk, you worked at the State Department for years. It's a different skill set, and it's a different set of procedures and systems that are in place, all of which now have been lost. And can it be recreated? Yes. Will it be? I don't think so. And actually, I hope not. I mean, it should be built back better than the way that it was. And I do hope that over time, that the US government will recognize what has been lost and work to put some of the best of USAID back into place in whatever format it is. I think that there's a good reason to do it within the State Department, but it will take a lot of just years to attract the talent that's needed and put the systems in place, and frankly, to rebuild trust around the world, because I think America has lost a fair amount of trust. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me just say, from the State Department's point of view,
I'm well walked. Thank you.
from the State Department's point of view as well, I think you're right. The State Department is not geared up to do aid programs. I mean, that's not to say that you couldn't take some personnel who work for aid and bring them into the State Department. But the whole structure of the department is much more around political issues. And it would be something off on the side, which probably wouldn't get handled properly. I know, speaking personally, during the 1990s, I worked closely with the aid people and the US military, both in Bosnia and in Rwanda. And aid had these disaster assistance response teams, which would respond very quickly to crises. I can tell you that in Bosnia and in Rwanda, they saved lots of lives they knew what to bring in, they knew what to bring in right away. And when we got the military involved, the military became very responsive. And I worked with the US commander for forces in Europe, General Jowin, at the time in the 1990s. And none of the military people are that crazy about doing humanitarian relief, bringing things in quickly, but they understand that they're going to be asked to do it, and they want to be able to do it quickly when they do it. So both the military and USAID were the best that were out there in terms of getting these what was necessary into these conflict zones right away. So that was so I think that was very positive, and it's very, from a State Department point of view, it's really sad to see AID dismantled the way it was dismantled, because in many of our programs around the world, many programs, AID was the major part of the program in a lot of these poor countries. And if you go, you mentioned PEPFAR, if you go to Africa, PEPFAR and George Bush were considered heroes in many of these sub-Saharan countries, because PEPFAR program for HIV/AIDS has saved millions and millions of lives, and it's what we were best known for in those countries.
You know, I just, on that point, a year ago, in June, I was in Botswana with General Langley, who was the head of AFRICOM, with different combat commands. You mentioned Europe, but the general who ran AFRICOM had his Chiefs of Defense conference in Botswana and asked me to come to Botswana with him and General Brown. Really is like their keynote speaker to talk about the work that USAID did, in particular about PEPFAR, but more broadly, because, you know, when he is dealing with these governments across the continent, the thing he wants to lead with is USAID, because, you know, that there was so much that USAID was doing on the ground in these countries that was delivering for people. So, you know, I spent a lot of time in the military for exactly that reason.
Yeah, and it was nice to see it. In fact, in my day, after we saw what had happened in Bosnia, we set up, I don't know if it still exists, we set up a cell within the UN in Geneva. It was called the MCDU, the Military Civil Defense Unit. And we had militaries from various countries come and be permanently in that cell and be practicing how to respond to crises. So when a crisis arrived, they could get the food in quickly. I know when the crisis arrived in Bosnia, I went to Geneva, and UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, which was the lead UN agency at the time, had simply sent out these lists of, I forget what they called them. They were requests for assistance, and they've been sent out, and donor countries wanted to respond, but frankly, because it took months for their militaries to understand exactly what had to be carried out, there were a lot of people that died in the meantime. So getting the militaries involved was a very positive thing. Why don't we take a few questions? Sir.
Yeah, what is the relationship between the World Health Organization and USAID? Are they connected in any way, or?
The World Health Organization is a UN body, which is comprised of member states that make up the World Health Organization. USAID was one of the largest funders of the World Health Organization, but
So is that funding disappeared?
a lot of it has been reduced.
We withdrawn as a member, I believe.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is a shame. The World Health Organization
yeah.
is the organization that responds to health crises around the world. And you may have some complaints. One of our complaints was too much dominated by the Chinese. I have no idea whether that was true or not, but to withdraw from the organization and not be involved is a big negative in terms of protecting us all from
Well,
future.
yeah, I mean, you mentioned
Pandemics.
smallpox. Smallpox in the 20th century killed between 300 and 500 million people. It was a huge killer, and you know, without WHO and USAID, that wouldn't have happened.
No, it's true. I think the USAID has been the largest funder of every assistance delivery organization in the UN system. So it's the largest funder, single largest funder of WHO, of UNICEF, which does all the childhood immunization work for the UN, of UNHCR, which you mentioned, of what's the other one? World Food Program. So, you know, without a doubt, the funding that is being pulled out of the system will just have a massive cascading effect around the world. And, you know, as I said, you're going to see fewer people vaccinated, fewer children vaccinated, just less food being provided to those in need, less food being produced because of the, you know, so much of the work that USAID was doing was around agricultural productivity in a lot of countries. You know, I just want to give one example. When the US pulled out of Afghanistan, people were predicting, you remember it, that there'd be millions of refugees pouring out of the country, that people were gonna starve. And it didn't happen. You don't even read about Afghanistan because USAID poured billions of dollars in food assistance and in technical assistance into Afghanistan in the last 4 years to prevent that from happening. And, you know, it had a massive impact. In fact, you've seen in some ways net migration back to Afghanistan. It's been partly driven by neighboring countries kicking Afghans out, but it's also been Afghans saying, well, the Taliban is odious, but the country is at peace now, largely. And it's, you know, I actually might be able to scratch out a living there better than in Iran or in Pakistan, where they've been trying to do so in recent years. But it's that type of, you know, you see the headlines, the disasters of what's happened, but, you know, with all of the fighting that's been going on in Haiti, you haven't seen tens of thousands of Haitians taking the boats, you know, over the last several years. It's partly because the USAID has been on the ground, really trying to improve conditions there with, you know, food assistance and vaccinations and all sorts of other things. It's hard to predict how the impacts of this will show up over time, but it will.
Isabel, could you talk a little bit about USAID's role in some of the current crises like in Gaza, Ukraine, or Sudan?
So you picked out 3 that I spent an enormous amount of my time personally on. I also sat on our National Security Council, and those were 3 crises that took a fair amount of bandwidth for the US government writ large. And USAID played a very heavy role in all of them. And I spent quite a bit of time in Ukraine over the last several years, and just a lot of work put into on the humanitarian side on Ukraine. So USAID was very involved in humanitarian response there and providing direct budget support to the Ukrainian government to help keep basic services running as they used every single penny that they had to fight the war. We were providing some direct budget support to help them keep paying school teachers and first responders and keeping the lights on, as when Putin really went after their energy grid to destroy Ukraine, and with the idea that if you made Ukraine dark and cold, that they would give up. You know, USAID scoured the world for generators, for substation components. We just moved heaven and earth to get the different components into Ukraine to keep the lights on, and worked with the Europeans to connect Ukraine's energy grid to Europe's energy grid. You know, lots of work with neighboring countries, not only on energy, but then working with neighboring countries when the Black Sea was closed to help get Ukrainian grain out of Odessa and the Black Sea that was then shut down. Ukraine is a breadbasket of the world. You had one breadbasket, Russia invade another, Ukraine. And, you know, USAID being the lead agency for food security around the world, we were faced with a massive food crisis when many of the poorest countries that relied on wheat from Ukraine were no longer able to access that. So figuring out different ways to get the grain out over overland routes through Eastern Europe, Romania in particular. You know, we were doing improvements for customs to be able to clear it, and infrastructure improvements, all of these types of things. I mean, these are the types of very quick interventions that USAID was able to do. That could the State Department do it? Yes, over time, but not today. And you know how it works. It would take years for it to be able to do something like that. So we've lost a lot of just tools in our toolkit from a foreign policy perspective. And in Gaza, I mean, it's a very painful experience. That was very, very difficult trying to get food into Gaza, and watching all of the, impediments to that. And Sudan also, another war-torn country where it was so hopeful just a few years ago when, a dictator who'd been in power for almost 40 years was overthrown by a democratic movement. You then had the hope for a real democratic transition, and then there was a coup and military took over, and then the civil war and the fighting started, and the country has the worst famine in the world right now going on is in Sudan, and it's barely even talked about or reported on. So that is
Going back to Gaza, did USAID work with UNRWA? How did they?
No.
deliver aid?
No. Interestingly, for a historical reason, the State Department worked with UNRWA, but USAID worked with the World Food Program, which is another UN agency. So when UNRWA basically became persona non grata in Gaza from an Israeli perspective, USAID took the lead on food assistance through the World Food Program, which had different systems and had to put different systems in place to be able to deliver food.
But it wasn't being attacked by the Israelis. Israelis were really attacking them.
The Israelis were, and in some cases, rightly so, very suspicious of UNRWA, and they had less suspicion about the World Food Program. So it was able to get more done.
More questions?
Hi, I actually work for a nonprofit that was a contractor, USAID, and hearing you speak about that time in February was a little bit traumatizing. It was 10 days, everything was dismantled and contracts were canceled, and we had to start laying off people on the spot because our cash flow was cut off. Looking at, you were talking about some of the consequences, and that's what we've really been focused on. And just three that I've been noticing. I think one is other funders are not stepping up. It's actually the opposite. The European funders are consumed by the conflicts, they're giving resources to Ukraine, they're not stepping up. Some of the smaller foundations are trying, even larger ones like the Gates Foundation, they can't come close to filling the gap. We're seeing that actually there's no data to understand the gap, but USAID is finding a lot of the data, the demographic and health surveys, data systems, so the countries don't know themselves what they're not able to, what the gaps are. And there is just this backlash. There is such a backlash, not just against the United States, but against foreign aid in general. The countries don't trust it anymore, they don't want to be part of it. And there is such this, I think, missing piece of the story, the system strengthening part that my organization has worked on, that I personally have worked on for 30 years, that doesn't show up in the data and the statistics, and how the expertise has been built, the systems have been built. There is no one investing in that. So what's going to happen 10 years from now when the brain drain that we're already seeing is starting to take effect? I think that the consequences are going to be immeasurable.
I looked at, just before coming, I looked at the OECD DAC numbers, the Development Assistance Committee, and they're kind of the ones who keep the numbers for the Western countries as to who's giving what. And they have set the developed countries have set a standard of 0.7% of national income is what the standard is for countries to give in terms of development assistance. And the only countries that exceed that are, you mentioned Norway, but the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Denmark also do. But the rest of us are all way below. And last year, in 2024, the DAC reported that the amount of official assistance being given by all countries declined by 7%, and is going to decline by maybe twice that this year. So it's a real crisis that, if you put those together, you're losing, 20% of your contributions, and it's for the reasons you said. The French are cutting, the Germans are cutting, the Brits are cutting, and they're all cutting because they have pressures on their budget primarily from Ukraine, but also domestic reasons. And so we're really short.
I just want to say it didn't start this year after the US built out. It has been a trend going on for a number of years. If you looked at a DAC report from 3 years ago, there were more countries at the 0.7%. You know, you had the UK in that group. You had some that had stretched to get there, but they are under enormous pressure. They're facing the same political pressures that we face in this country, where people can have a, you know, focus on the home front and not overseas. And so that is a trend that's been happening. With the shutdown of USAID, you've seen that dramatically accelerate. And one of the things that I spent a lot of my time on in past years is dialing for dollars. You know, you'd call up and pressure other governments to meet what we're doing in Ethiopia or in Sudan or in Gaza or wherever it was. And, you know, that pressure worked in their system. You know, they would cough up more money. No one's doing that now. And so now that trend that had been happening is only going to accelerate. And, you know, you're just going to see a massive restructuring go on. Some of it, you know, look, if you actually look at spending levels, they had reached an all-time high in foreign assistance in recent years. And I think it peaked probably in 2022 or 2023 with the war in Ukraine, with Europeans providing much more in terms of total foreign assistance. But those very, very high levels of spending were historically high and clearly unsustainable. So, you know, we have to all, as a world in the foreign assistance realm, learn how to do more with less. It's just, we have to do that. And there was a lot of room for improvement. And I think what you'll see is some countries stepping up and, you know, taking better care of themselves. But I'm afraid you're going to see a lot of countries do what they've always done, which is be run by corrupt elites who are going to let their people really, really suffer. And the world will suffer for it too. They'll just have less healthy, less educated populations around the world.
So what happened, Isabel? I mean, when I was years ago, when I was in the State Department, but we had bipartisan support, especially for humanitarian assistance, but also for the aid programs overall. And people like Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham and others were big supporters of the aid program. And then suddenly, I mean, did you see this coming before the most recent election? Or that there was political pressure building against aid even back then? Or is this all just a result of one person taking over the Republican Party?
No, you've had these pressures for decades. I mean, you've had people bad-mouthing foreign assistance going back, you know, decades, really. In the words of one Republican, called it money down a rat's hole, and, you know, all sorts of opprobrium being leveled at just the concept of foreign assistance. You're right, there was a bipartisan consensus that held. It held on, and in fact, you had people like Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio and others being real champions of assistance. You know, the answer to that question is a hard one. I think you have seen just a seismic shift politically in the country, that it didn't start in 2024. It started, you know, a decade earlier, and you've had these swings going on. It was there. I'm often asked the question, did I see this coming? No, actually, I didn't see the shutdown of USAID coming. It wasn't even in Project 2025, you know, that the Heritage Foundation did. There's no mention of shutting down USAID. It certainly calls for reforming it and taking, you know, even harder measures than we were already doing to push it to be more streamlined, more effective. But it wasn't under discussion. Trump never said the words US Agency for International Development once on the campaign trail. You know, you can go do a search for it. It just didn't show up. So did I anticipate it? No, actually, I thought you'd see a reduction in budgets because the budgets, as I said, were historically high. And they were gonna come down. They were under enormous pressure already. And they were gonna come down. And I expected to see budget cuts of as much as, 30%. And in some ways, that's not the end of the world. You can find ways to do more with less. And it causes you to, look, there's enormous bureaucratic inertia too. USAID had programs that were going on that should not have been happening. It wasn't that they were fraudulent. It was that they weren't as necessary as they once were. I called it the Christmas tree. Just kept hanging more ornaments on this Christmas tree. It needed to be, some things you have to say, stop doing that. There was a purpose for it, a reason for it years ago, but don't do it anymore. And the bureaucratic resistance to stopping anything was enormously high. So, it would have been, I think, in some ways, a healthy process of forcing change and forcing streamlining and forcing greater efficiencies in a time of austerity. That is not all bad, but shutting it down, no. I see Jose just walked in. I should pose the question to him. My comrade at the State Department over the recent years. Did you see the shutdown of USAID coming?
Sorry for being late. It was always in the fringes. Then people like you could talk about that far and the millions of lives that we USAID say, but no, it's been broad with both of them.
Yeah.
Was it a push from Doge?
Yeah,
that really killed him.
Yeah, but why? Doge, I think, saw it as a juicy target. It doesn't have a domestic constituency. They wanted to come in and have some big, high-profile wins really early on. They trashed it reputationally, said it was all bad. Let's get rid of it. And here's like billions and billions of savings. Now, if you remember, Elon Musk came out saying he was going to cut 2 trillion from the budget. Then he said, no, not 2 trillion. I'm going to cut 1 trillion from the budget. Now it's down to, I don't know, a couple $100 billion, which is not nothing, but when all of it, or a good chunk of it is USAID, it's sort of like, what have we achieved here, people? But it was an easy target because you didn't have you don't have all those poor people around the world. They don't have a voice. So you did see, some domestic voices, whether it's organizations like yours that lost funding, but the whole kind of aid industry was vilified too, and it was made to seem like it was filled with people who were on the take and just stealing money. And it's really horrendous to see.
Trump called them left-wing lunatics.
I think he called me a left-wing lunatic. It's very sad to see how easily that narrative took hold, and the very people that you would think, the Lindsey Grahams, the Marco Rubios, Lindsey Graham silent, and Marco Rubio jumping on the bandwagon saying USAID had no accountability. Senator Rubio, you sat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and approved every single, not just our budget, but every single congressional notification that we did to get any funding approved. You approved every one. You had accountability. For a decade, he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So, it just, people don't really understand how Washington works. And I think, unfortunately, as I said, the fabrications and gross distortions easily took hold, too easily.
Robin, you got a question?
Yeah, I wonder if you could expand a little bit. You said that USAID was an alternative to China, which was putting a lot of pressure on governments of poor countries. I was wondering, was China offering the same kind of assistance that USAID did? In what way was it an alternative to what China was doing? What was China doing, I guess is the question.
So China was offering very different forms of assistance. USAID largely provided grants to countries. And the US government writ large provided either highly concessional lending through organizations like the World Bank, where the US is the largest funder, or directly in a bilateral way. And grant funding for infrastructure projects through, for example, the Millennium Challenge Corporation and other US agencies. So it was mostly in the form of grants and concessional lending. China has provided more what we think of as more predatory lending, where much of the loans are collateralized by the projects themselves that result in China getting long-term leases through the work that they're doing, particularly if countries cannot service the loans that they have taken on. So, you know, when I say it's an alternative, you know, countries like the US, it has, I think, very strong relations, cultural affinity with a lot of countries. I'm thinking of one of the last trips I did as deputy administrator was to the Pacific, and you know, there are these little countries that rely enormously on the United States. Some of them, like Palau and Micronesia and others, they have they get budget support from the United States. They have actual rights to work in the United States, and in return, we get basing rights and we get access to airstrips on their islands, but they are feeling enormous pressure from China. And, you know, they're all looking for economic development and jobs for people, and being able to meet with heads of these countries and talk about the work that we're doing to provide clean energy or to training for their young people. I mean, these are things that they were very, very excited about, USAID programming in these countries. And it was really a sign for them that they haven't been abandoned. That even though China was coming in and offering them, in some ways, bigger infrastructure projects than the United States was, they had come to recognize that it came with a lot of strings attached, and they didn't like it. And but they needed to be able to point to something that we were giving them to. And even though from a pure financial sense on paper, it might not have looked as much, they could see that it was without the same strings attached. Of course, we have some, and we have these historical relations with the countries. We have bases in some of them, but in some of them, those relations are really frayed because of the pressure. And it's not just in the Pacific; it's also in Africa. You see it across the country, and some of the countries in Africa that I spent a fair amount of time in were, they're very focused on developing their own natural resources. They have done deals with China, and they've come to regret it. They have buyer's remorse because the deals are not providing them with the revenues that they thought it would be. A lot of Chinese workers are being brought in to do the projects. There are no health and safety standards in place. People are dying, and their environment is being really badly damaged. And so they're looking for an alternative. They're looking for a different way of doing things. And the Congo. I mean, we did a lot of work in Eastern Congo, and the Chinese control a lot of the mining in Katanga in the east and all the different provinces in Eastern Congo. And it's a lot of critical minerals. It's lithium, it's cobalt, it's copper. And they now recognize that they haven't gotten a great deal from China, but they're looking to the United States to offer something better. And it is incumbent on the US government to be able to articulate how it is better. Part of what USAID did was to help, when I talked about public financial management, one of the things that USAID would do is provide technical experts to governments to help them evaluate when they were doing an infrastructure deal and putting it out for bid. Taking the cheapest bid wasn't always in their best interest. And so we would provide them with technical experts to be able to do side-by-side bid evaluations of what they were actually getting. And it really would help them make smarter decisions. But, you know, trying to clean up, and I say clean it up both environmentally, but also from a corruption perspective, some of these sectors like mining was a lot of the type of work that USAID was doing.
Robin?
Thank you, Isabel. I'm curious to know when it happened so fast, the destruction of USAID, but we often testify at any point with any interest by the Congress and committees, or it just happened too fast.
No, there were some hearings, but the most, I think the most, and the most effective people who were called to testify, I think, were Republicans. You know, you had people like Andrew Natsios, who was president and administrator of USAID. He was a very effective spokesperson, talking about the value of USAID and what it did, and acknowledging, yes, there's room for improvement, but don't shut it down. It was not a political environment that really wanted to hear from the likes of me, but they did hear from people like Andrew Natsios, and I think it's a shame that they didn't hear from more Republicans who led USAID through many great iterations. And, you know, I think more could have been said, but let's be honest, I think there's an element of fear that's been instilled in the system in some ways of getting on the wrong side of powerful forces and Elon Musk and down. So, thank you.
Yes.
To remind them to the China discussion and mining rights and structure. You think about the DFC and their role in potentially stepping and replacing some of what you're doing in USAID, competing with China. Your thoughts on them, Jim?
What's the DFC?
The DFC is the Development Finance Corporation. It was an agency created in 2018 out of the old OPIC, which is the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which had for many years helped American companies make investments overseas. So in 2018, it became when the first Trump administration tried to shut down OPIC, that bipartisan consensus came to the forefront and said, don't shut it down, make it into a development finance corporation with focus on development. And actually, in my role, I served as the vice chair of the DFC over the last 4 years. And USAID and DFC worked very, very in a very complementary fashion, where USAID would provide some grant funding upfront, and then also provide some funding in sort of an ancillary way to help get deals over the finish line, where the DFC could come in and has a $60 billion balance sheet and can come in with concessional lending. And, you know, can it do some of what USAID was doing? Absolutely. I think it's hard, and there's a bill under consideration to double the balance sheet from 60 to 120 billion. USAID, DFC was authorized for only 5 years, so now it's up for reauthorization. And as part of that process, it's thought that they will increase the balance sheet, which will allow them to do more. But when you have a $120 billion balance sheet, it's really hard to do small deals. And many of these countries, they're very poor. They don't have much liquidity, and the smaller deals can be much more developmentally impactful than big deals. You know, you're not going to put a big plastics factory in Niger, poorest country in the world. You can put it in Turkey, then you can question, well, how much does Turkey really need a plastics factory when, you know, when the focus should be on development? So it just becomes harder at that size without a USAID as a partner, or whatever. It doesn't have to be USAID, it won't be USAID, but the State Department perhaps as a partner to be able to be doing the smaller funding to make countries more eligible for DFC financing. So I think it can do some of it, but it won't be able to do all.
Other questions?
You talked a little bit about entering the stage of USAID, doing more with less, and part of that was the potential budget cuts that was coming down pipeline. But I'm curious, based on kind of your goals and your teammates' goals for the organization having to potentially do more with less, are there examples, either domestically or abroad, of organizations that are doing really effective aid and development work very efficiently, either it's on the ground or kind of remotely, that may serve as models in the future? USAID is rebuilt as it once was, and kind of takes different shape, either with the State Department or different portion of the federal government, that would be useful to say, hey, look, these folks are doing this is really effective.
That's a great question. There are some organizations that are infused with the same cost effectiveness focus that I talked about, really trying to instill in USAID. And in fact, full disclosure, I used to work at Give Directly. That's an organization that did direct cash transfers to the very poor, based on hard evidence that giving the poorest of the poor cash transfers, as opposed to coming in with consultants and trying to teach them how to do this or how to do that, that actually the reason they often know how to spend the money, more often than not, they know exactly what they need to do. And they've gone through multiple training programs, but they have no cash to get started. So if you don't spend $1,000 per person, that if you took one of these big expensive UN or NGO or USA programs with spending and gave them, even half of that as a cash transfer, they could actually go out and buy a cow or buy a tractor or buy a generator or buy a bicycle or cooking pots and start a business. So, there are organizations that have taken that really to heart and understand the research and the data around what actually works. And I was talking about that earlier, about cost effectiveness. And in fact, if you go back 30 years, to Andrew Natsios, I just talked about Andrew Natsios, he was Bush's aid administrator. During his tenure, USAID was delivering to these crises around the world. USAID was delivering food, like literally food, physical food. It was incredibly expensive to ship it from Europe or the United States. You certainly had political support for doing that because it was American ships and American grain and wheat, but it was extraordinarily expensive way to do it. And by the way, when you dumped food in these local markets, be it Somalia or Indonesia after the tsunami, what did you do? You destroyed the local markets. So people came to understand that the best way to deal with a crisis is if you can deliver cash, you just zap it there, and then it stimulates local markets. People use the cash to rebuild their houses, rebuild their lives, and they spend it very quickly. Rather than coming in and trying in a US way to build people new houses, you just give them the cash. They go and they get this and that and buy it, and they can do it for a tiny fraction of the cost. So the humanitarian space has evolved hugely since those years. USAID and the UN, they provide cash today. They're not lugging food around the world. They do in some cases for political reasons, but mostly it's cash. The big transition in the past decade has been understanding that cash can also work in a development context. Providing cash to people can actually be the most cost-effective way to reduce malnutrition, to get higher outcomes in school, to get higher school attendance, if you simply give people cash. So we've seen some of that around the world. And the team of economists that, I really built at USAID, that team still exists and is being used by some other international development agencies today, some of the Scandinavian countries, some of the European countries. They're looking at what we have built at USAID. We've got this whole team of people together and they want to know, okay, well, show us. We were in the process of building a dashboard, show us the dashboard. Let's see, what are the interventions that actually work, that can move the needle? And they're,
consumer the same ease of cancellation that it was for them to sign out. And so
This is the one answer question.
Don't. No.
Yes, John.
Yeah.
A little history. I'm gonna ask, what was the initial impulse that brought USAID, made it come about? The reason I'm asking is because if it disappears, but then the world decides, or we decide as a nation that in sometime in the future would be good to restore it, could that initial impulse be brought to bear? Was it a person? Was it an idea? Was it
it was
all of the above?
it was a person and an idea. It was John F. Kennedy.
Uh-huh.
And it was, 1962, and it was the height of the Cold War, and it was a real sense of, internationally, not ask what, your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. It was this spirit of taking American values overseas, promoting democracy, promoting capitalism, promoting economic growth at the height of the Cold War. And it was couched very much in those terms. I encourage all of you to go read John F. Kennedy's speech that he gave when he launched USAID. Can that happen again today? Oh, I don't know. I know, it's a different world today, and maybe, maybe, but it would require bipartisan consensus, or, for those in power to again believe in foreign assistance. So.
Yes, question back there?
Yeah, this one's not a sexy. Can you give your experience? You and your teams, I don't know where you were based, you got an email, said you people are done. Here's a ticket from whatever country your people are in. You're heading back to JFK and good luck. What was the process to you and your people when the announcement came down? If they're deployed all over the world, right? You're like, they got a pink slip.
So just to be very clear, I didn't get a pink slip because I worked for President Biden and I left when President Biden left office. So this all happened the month after I left. So I was gone.
Yeah.
And, it was a little, the thing that triggered what went from sort of a scrutiny of USAID to a shutdown of USAID was an order came down to halt all payments. And I know that the folks who were,
You need payroll of our own staff?
it was, American payroll was being processed, but in country, USAID employed foreign service nationals. And it was the local staff who weren't going to be paid. And someone, I don't know who, at USAID made a decision to actually process those payments. And that made the Doge team go ballistic. And it went from scrutiny to shutdown. And I'm sure that in the process of doing it, there was also the realization that, hey, this is playing well with the American public. We're getting a lot of juice from all these salacious stories about USAID, and it makes the whole Doge movement look so necessary and so urgent given all this waste, fraud, and abuse that's going. So, but it was the processing of payroll for foreign service nationals that sparked this. And it was it didn't happen immediately, but it happened over kind of weeks and days and weeks, as it became clear that no, this isn't a temporary pause. Like, they are really going to shut this agency down. And then you had a cable that went out from, I don't know, I think about 40 or 50 State Department ambassadors signed it pleading, like, don't shut down USAID. We have all these programs like midstream. We won't even be able to, from a in a responsible financial manner, shut these programs down. Like, we need our USAID colleagues. Nope, just done. And so people were pulled out of country, and it was really, really sudden.
Isabel, I wonder if we could, to take full advantage of your presence, we could ask a question or two about the UN. Because when you were there, you were responsible for management and reform of the UN. And so maybe your comments about possible reform of Security Council has been such an issue in keeping the UN from being able to do very much. And also, I know you're involved in peacekeeping. Maybe a few words about the good things that the UN does around the world in terms of peacekeeping. Because there's a lot of peacekeeping out there, which has been useful in damping down conflicts and resolving issues. If that's your perspective, this is the State Department perspective on this.
Well, why don't I start with peacekeeping? I think the reality is that peacekeeping can be effective, but in the same way that I was talking about programs at USAID that get started, that when somebody new like me comes in and looks at it and says, why on earth are we doing this in that country? Well, the answer is nobody wants to change it. And it's a little bit the same with peacekeeping. I think people don't understand fully that peacekeeping is a money-making business for the countries that contribute the troops. And so they get a real vested interest in stasis, of keeping the big peacekeeping missions going, even when change might be better. But that's not always true. I mean, we've got sometimes countries are trying to kick the peacekeepers out. Sometimes they're trying to hold on to them because they bring money into the economy. There's no one size fits all. But what I will tell you is, I dealt with Haiti a lot at USAID. And Haiti just spiraled downward from a security perspective. And we did end up with Kenyan troops on the ground in Haiti after enormous cajoling by the United States to try to get some type of security force in Haiti. But we had, in a prior era, a peacekeeping mission in Haiti. And yes, it caused a lot of problems. The troops brought cholera to Haiti, and 10,000 people died. There was sexual abuse among peacekeepers. But for all of those reasons, the peacekeeping mission in Haiti was shut down. But then the country spiraled into the most unspeakable violence. And nobody wants to put troops back. American troops aren't going around there. So in a way, it's, I always say foreign policy is not a choice between good and better. It's between bad and worse. And it's trying to figure that out. And, in a way, UN peacekeepers can be the bad option as opposed to the even worse option. So I don't think that they're, that the UN peacekeepers have a lot of failures that they can look back on. You mentioned Bosnia, you mentioned Rwanda earlier. I mean, these are two really egregious examples of failures of peacekeeping. But they also, were absolutely instrumental in places like Liberia. Liberia, you don't read about it anymore. It's a country that went through a terrible civil war. It's still very poor. But I was in Liberia, I think it was last year, for the presidential inauguration of their new president. And you had on the stage the outgoing president, and President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, 3 democratically elected presidents of Liberia. It's kind of amazing. And UN peacekeepers played a role in enabling that to happen. I think they stayed too long, but the cost of having peacekeepers on the ground in Liberia versus the horrendous, cancerous civil war in West Africa that it was for so long is minuscule.
And they've been helpful in other, like
They've been helpful in
UNIFIL in
places.
Lebanon.
Well, I don't think highly of UNIFIL in Lebanon. They were supposed to be keeping a demilitarized zone in southern Lebanon along the border with Israel, and Hezbollah amassed massive rockets and everything else there. So it's a mixed bag, but it can be effective. It can be. But I wouldn't call out UNIFIL as one of the more effective ones.
And how about reform of the Security Council?
I think that when we have another John F. Kennedy type president calling for the restoration of American, greatness overseas and foreign assistance, we may also have Security Council reform, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. And Security Council reform is just almost impossible to happen, because the 5 permanent members of the Security Council don't want to dilute their veto power. And the United States is probably, certainly among them, but not the hardest over on that. I mean, I would say that China and Russia are the hardest over on that. And I just don't see it happening.
We've made noises about suggesting that India would be entitled to a permanent seat.
Yes. We've also made noises about Japan getting a permanent seat, Brazil, South Africa. It's not going to happen, because every country on the Security Council has, beef with some other country that might be a possibility. So China will never allow India or Japan to become members of the Security Council.
I also saw, recently I saw a plan.
Sorry, China in the context of China today.
But I saw a plan to consolidate all the UN operational agencies together. UNHCR, UNICEF, UNDP.
Look, I think that there's huge value to that in a lot of ways. It's a lot of redundancy, overlap, competition among these agencies. I think that the US, as the largest funder of all of these agencies, should be using its heft, its leverage much more strongly with the UN agencies to force them to realize the economies of scale that they could have from some of these operational changes. But having negotiated at the UN, I can tell you it's extraordinarily difficult to get anything done. You have to get all the member states together to agree, and they just won't and don't. They feel it's really important to keep an operational hub in Italy, and one in Spain, and one in Uganda, and one in Nairobi. I mean, it's just, they become captured by their host countries and by political interests. But there are enormous room for improvement with the UN agencies. John Bolton used to say that the UN would be better off if you knocked the top 5 floors off of its headquarters. And I say I disagree. I think you could knock the top 10 floors off, and it would be much better. Who would think that today, that I disagree with John Bolton on a number of things, but he is a public servant, a true American, and he is under enormous attack right now. So I do think that there is a lot of room for improvement in efficiency and effectiveness in the UN system operationally. Politically, there's almost very little that changed from the Security Council perspective.
Right. Who else has a question they'd like to?
do like one.
One more?
Yeah.
Last
Right.
question? Anybody want to ask the last question? Carol?
I just wanted to say that in the beginning you stated you're glad so many people are interested in USAID, that nobody really knows about it. Isn't that a real problem? I mean, if this ever happened again, if another agency was started, I mean, would it be different? I mean, people don't know, Congress doesn't know, nobody knows, but USA, most people do.
Congress does know what USA does.
The current Congress.
Many in the current Congress, know. Many, many, many. They do. I think many Americans don't know anything about Washington. How many here know what, someone asked a question about the Development Finance Corporation, how many here have heard of that? No,
But Isabel, was one of the failures that AIG did not let more of Americans know the good things they were doing? I
well,
think more could have been done through.
could more have been done, sure, but. You know, I know that Samantha Power and I together and others, leaders at USA, we were constantly traveling to various congressional districts to talk about the work of USAID. And I know that previous leadership of USAID likewise did, you know, we would host student groups, we would give talks, we would travel, you know, to Iowa and to Texas and to, you know, South Carolina. Why did we all go to South Carolina? Because Lindsey Graham, you know, would love to have people down to talk about USAID and, you know, and the role he played on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But, you know, I worked 24/7. There's only so much you can do. And a lot has been written about USAID that has debunked a lot of the, you know, real distortions that have been said about USAID. And people say, well, I don't know anything about it. I've never read it. I said, well, clearly you're not reading the New York Times. You're not reading the Financial Times. You're not reading the Washington Post. I don't know. You know, it's like, it's out there, but people are very siloed in what information they get. And it's hard to break through. And you don't hear, you know, my husband's a doctor. He says, oh, I hear from the patients who are unhappy. I don't hear for the 98% of the patients who are really happy. You don't hear that. It's not in the news, you know, the good news stories of USAID eradicating smallpox or, you know, making sure that, you know, food is being delivered to that doesn't get through. It just is not what people write about. And I think could more have been done? Of course, more could have been done. But I don't think there was any amount of us at leadership at USAID or prior leadership at USAID of preventing what just happened.
Well, with those somber words.